Webinar gets started in just a moment. I know some of you are saying you don't hear any sound. There's quite a few people that are registered, so we want to give them a chance to join. You also don't have the ability to chat, so we will be leveraging the Q&A pod to submit questions for the panel, but we will be getting started in just a moment.
Welcome everyone to this BCALA President's Program on when not to call the cops. I am Shantae Burns Simpson, President of the Black Caucus of ALA. I am thankful that you're here today. If you are a member of BCALA, thank you for being part of our family. If you're not yet a member of BCALA, we welcome you to become part of our amazing family. For more than 50 years, BCALA has supported Black or African librarians and communities. You can connect with us through our website or our social media channels. Please go to bcala.org to find more information. Today's session is part of our President's Program series, which is designed to support important conversations on libraries and people of color. My hope is to encourage a deeper discussion about what it means to ensure that Black lives matter in libraries. Due to the size of this webinar and the subject matter, the chat is turned off because we do want you to focus on the presentation, but we do invite you to post your questions in the Q&A section. Our speakers have a wealth of library experience. We are thrilled that they are joining us today. Dr. Emily Knox is Interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and an Associate Professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include information access, intellectual freedom and censorship, information ethics, information policy, and the intersection of print culture and reading practices. She is also a member of the Mapping Information Access Research Team. Emily received her PhD from the doctoral program at the Rutgers University School of Communication and Information. Her master's in library information science is from the iSchool at Illinois. She also holds a BA in religious studies from Smith College and an AM in the same field from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Jared Dapier is the young adult librarian at the Skokie Public Library in Illinois. Jared received his Master's of Library and Information Science degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is the 2016 recipient of the John Philip Imroth Award from the American Library Association for his work exposing book censorship in the Chicago public schools. He specialized in learning experiences. He loves reading, graphic novels, playing the drums, and drawing sleeping cats. Emily and Jared's powerful plea to protect Black patrons from American Libraries, their article from the American Libraries magazine is what really inspired this conversation today. I welcome Jared and Emily right now to please show us your presentation, and we will be taking questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantae. We're really happy to be here. So, as Shantae mentioned, Emily and I both wrote an article together for American Libraries called "When Not to Call the Cops," and it grew out of a couple things which we're going to go into. And the very first thing that I want to dive into is a story, and the story has to do with a 14-year-old boy and a vending machine. This happened at a library that I've worked at, and it happened a couple of years ago, but I feel like it illustrates a lot of the points that we want to dive into today regarding police presence in the libraries and the consequences of that presence. So this was an incident that occurred at the very beginning of the school year, which anyone who works with young adults and teens understands can be a refreshing, wonderful, exciting, and also stressful time of the year, particularly because certain members of the teenage population are feeling stress. And I have found over the course of my 10 years working with teens in public libraries that beginning ninth grade can be a source of big stress for 14-year-olds. And this was a 14-year-old that we knew. By we, I mean the young adult staff. I work with 3 others on staff in the young adult department. We knew this individual over the years. We've built a relationship with him, especially since this incident. We knew of him at this point, not a ton about him, but we knew his name, and we knew, we'd talked with him. And what happened was one day, 3 weeks into the school year, he tried to get some Doritos, and the vending machine did not give him his food. And anybody who's had this happen knows it's frustrating, but he got extremely angry. He was yelling, he was kicking the vending machine, he was demanding his money back. Somebody at the reader's services desk nearby called our safety staff, as they should have. Safety staff arrived, and that unfortunately antagonized him further, just their presence. And he started wailing on the vending machine, shouting, telling people to get away from him. It became an extreme situation. Unfortunately, young adult staff were not called. There was a librarian in the building who knew this boy. They weren't called, and unfortunately, as his behavior became louder and more aggressive, somebody at the reader services desk called the police, and the police arrived. And throughout this entire situation, the only person who was at risk of harm was the boy himself, because he was punching the vending machine. He could have hurt himself very badly, but it's not like he was pulling on it, as you've heard before, like he could have been crushed. He probably would have hurt his hand. But it became a situation where, in retrospect, we couldn't figure out as young adult librarians why a couple things didn't happen. Why didn't we just give him his money back? Someone on staff had $1. We could have just given it to him, and it probably would have ameliorated the situation. Why were police called instead of young adult librarian or the librarian in charge? Because we have a couple different levels at the library of people to call for backup. The police were called, and this boy, and it was at the end of the night in the library, he ended up in handcuffs and being led out to a squad car in front of patrons who were leaving the building for the evening. And what began ultimately, I mean, it started with a stuck bag of Doritos, and it ended up with handcuffs. And this did not have to be the outcome. What if we'd just given him the $1 so he could have his money back, or told him we'll put money in and try again? Then if we'd done that and maybe he'd gone on, staff could circle back with him the next day, talk with him and ask him if he's all right, ask him if he needs any support, ask him what's going on, especially the staff who have a relationship with him. Other alternatives could have been shutting down the cafe area and saying, I'm sorry, you can't come in here, to other patrons, and saying, we're dealing with a situation in here that just is going to take some time. If the young adult librarian had been called, she could have talked to him and sat down with him. She's a very talented individual and would have been great at, I think, connecting with him. But instead, it sort of ended with this extreme situation, in my point of view, where a 14-year-old boy couldn't get chips, and then he ended up in a squad car. And so this leads in really to a lot of what we want to talk about today, which is this concept of the library to prison pipeline. This idea that we are running spaces that I believe many on this call, hopefully all on this call, we run spaces that we don't want to be the cause of a young person or any person becoming involved in the criminal justice system. A 14-year-old becoming involved in the criminal justice system over the chips is just inexcusable in many ways, and can have lifelong ramifications. I don't believe that he ended up being charged with anything, but I'm sure, just knowing human nature, it was traumatizing. I'm sure that it was scary. I'm sure that it may have affected how he views the library, though luckily he did keep coming back, and did keep coming back until the pandemic started. I believe that's because of the relationships we continued to build with him as a staff. But I think it had big effects. And that's just one example. I've seen many over my years in libraries where police have not helped. And so, Emily, if you want to move on, we can also talk about how Emily and I came to this topic through a previous panel that we worked on together.
Just really quickly, Jared, just for clarification, the safety staff is security guards. And was there more than one?
Yeah, I should clarify that. At this library, we have 4 safety staff. They are used as security. So at another library, they might be called security. The reason we call them safety is because we want, it ties into the institutional values of safety and welcoming, and that it be a space for people to feel safe, those in crisis and those who are, just browsing. But our safety staff at this library, 3 of the 4 are trained in either not social work, but have experience working with homeless individuals. special education students and teenagers, either in the foster system or with significant traumatic life experiences. And so luckily 3 of those 4 really have perspective about teen behavior and also crisis and just extreme situations and how they affect people. And it's made them very effective at also relationship building.
Do they wear a uniform?
They do. They wear sort of a shirt exactly like mine, but that's it. And they're not armed or anything like that. I know there are private safety companies sometimes that are contracted out that might carry a taser, which I highly would argue against. But ours are not armed. They just have a communication system, so we can all communicate very quickly with each other, which is also very effective.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Jared and I were on a panel about confronting white nationalism in libraries. And one thing I really think about a lot is, what do we mean by structural racism? I think that a lot of times when we discuss it, we talk about it at a very high level and a very low level. So we talk about things like wealth inequality, and we talk about things like the names of schools or statues. But where I think it really plays out is in a mesa level, right? This middle level. So what I said was, I don't even need to ask people here. I know who are the people who aren't allowed in your library, who get into trouble a lot in your library, because of the way that we construct certain people. And so as I think about that, to me, that is the actually insidious part of structural racism, is that even in a space like the library, it is often young people, especially young Black and Brown people, who are seen as being problems of various sorts. And we know this, like, we know that because of structural racism, kindergartners end up being suspended when they are Black, even though they are 6 years old, 5 years old. And to me, that is the level that we don't address quite as much. And so as I was talking about this, I was like, well, where do libraries fit in this? How do we think about our policies? How are our policies applied unequally to people because of the world in which we live, because of white supremacy, because of structural racism? So that's really how we moved from thinking about white nationalism as a whole, and then we started thinking about this more and thinking about more personal observations to what we see within our own institutions that are actually part of a larger picture that we often don't talk about, because we kind of get stuck at this large level or at this really sort of, I would say, kind of a base level, instead of thinking about it in between.
This I want to mention really grows out of the person who's next to me in that photo. Nora Flanagan wrote with the Western States Center. The person on the far right is Eric Ward. He's the executive director of the Western States Center, which is committed to combating white power movements on the West Coast and combating misinformation. He's a brilliant person. Check out their organization if you haven't heard of them. And Nora, who's next to me, is a friend of Eric's, and she's a Chicago Public Schools teacher. Along with Eric and others, she wrote a toolkit, which is downloadable online, called Confronting White Nationalism in Schools. And I found it to be a really sensitive document that is really attuned to youth development and how kids are exposed to racist ideas, white power, white hate, and how they might perpetuate those things without fully understanding what they're talking about. And she and others really address the topic in the toolkit as something that you don't, if you confront it in your classroom or in your school, they have different levels of how white nationalism might present itself. from a kid saying something or scratching out a swastika to a kid wearing a patch that's has an insignia to an organizing flyer. There are different levels of like presence, and they recommend how to deal with those. And it always starts with relationship building. And what I love about that is I really believe that to combat white supremacy, we need to be strategic. And part of that comes from the relationship building with youth, especially, and not being like, not sort of smashing down on their head, but investigating. Do you understand what this is? Do you know where this comes from? And what I love about what Emily talked about is white nationalism in libraries. Ultimately, you know, there was a lot, what if we see organizing from a white power group in the library? What do we do? What if our teenagers are bringing those insignias in? But Emily directed us brilliantly to internal policy. How does the library itself, how do our own libraries perpetuate white supremacy? And I really believe that what Emily hit on with policies, internal policies, is really one of the most sort of fertile places for where it can grow or just be maintained. And that led us to policing. It made me reflect on, you know, at a previous library, how often we used the police, even though we had a security staff at this other library. The library called the police all the time. We did not in young adult services, but the police were there all the time. And this is a library with high homeless patrons, lot of teenagers. Just, it's in a little bit more of an urban environment where than the one I'm in now. But I was pretty appalled when I realized, my God, they were there all the time. And I saw attacks and brutality from them against patrons that were just unacceptable and unnecessary. So yeah, moving on to our next slide, you know, I think what we're talking about too is we have to ask ourselves, as librarians or library staff, anybody who works in a library, what kind of space is the library? Who is it for? Personally, I think everybody probably has their own answers for this. Personally, I want the library for teenagers, and as I speak, I'm going to speak mostly from the like youth, young adult advocacy point of view, just because that's what I know. I want it to be a place where kids can feel safe, welcomed, curious. I want them to feel that they can be left alone if they want to be left alone. I want it to be a place of respite. I want it to be a place of connection, community, friends, learning, and a place where the sort of spirit and mind can feel free to explore. So that's me. Emily, Shantae, what do you think?
So when I teach my students about the library as a space, I think that especially public libraries are one of the most important spaces that we have in our country. There are so few free spaces that people can occupy. And I mean, like, just be in the space without having to pay something. And our libraries really provide that for many people, right? I mean, I'm working on, I just talked to one of my former advisees about meeting room spaces, because those can be very fraught. But it's so important because there are so few forums where people can come and talk. You know, the library is really one of the only places to do that. My mother is a former school librarian, and she talks about how she provided a quiet place for students. And I think especially in the pandemic, we are seeing that many people do not have quiet spaces at home. And that is one thing that a library can provide. And it's in fact a space that's at a premium. So how do we ensure that these spaces are for everybody? And the question we asked is, what is being communicated when you call the police into this space?
Well, just to answer your question, Jared, I want the space to be welcoming and I want them to feel wanted, that they know that we want them in this space and they're just not there by accident, that we want them there. So thank you for asking that. And I know that we are speaking about urban libraries, but we often hear from librarians in rural areas who struggle with implementing changes in their libraries. What advice would you offer those who work in regions or settings that resist the Black Lives Matters movement? And Jared, you could open up and then we could go to Emily.
Yeah, so first of all, both of what Emily and Shante, what you said, leads really well into all of your reasons for, or all of your descriptions of what a library is and should be and can be, is why policing in libraries is such a problem. And we'll get to that. But to your question, Shante, thank you, number one, for articulating and specifying Black lives, rural libraries that have a problem with Black Lives Matter, because, and I say that just because the media perpetuates so often this idea that rural equals white, that rural in America is a monolith. And that's just wrong. You know, all over the South, there are huge swaths of the area that are rural, but predominantly Black, or the Southwest, where Native, you know, folks, or the Northwest, where there are Indigenous folks, and then it's very rural. So thank you for saying specifically have a problem with Black Lives Matter, because that's the thing. And I think it's a hard thing to address. However, what I would say is that when it comes to policing in rural libraries, number one, do we want the police to be brought in? I think if you were talking to your board or to your director, if somebody is calling the police, I always see that as a sign that they don't feel supported. They don't feel supported to handle a situation. They don't feel like they've got the resources to do that. And I would begin with articulating, number one, I don't feel supported. And I think, number one, if you don't have a safety or security staff, we need that. We need that safety and security staff to be attuned to the issues of our community. If there's addiction problems in that community, if there's, if the library is seeing certain problems, who can best address that? Should it be the police? I would argue in 99% of cases, no. There is probably someone else that we should have a relationship with that we could call in. When it comes, and then in any of those communities, there's going to be people of color, there's going to be marginalized individuals who are scapegoated, but either by the community or the police or whoever. And we absolutely have to prioritize those people's safety. We have to prioritize their physical and emotional and mental safety. And this really speaks to what, actually, Shante, you said it in some notes that I read earlier, the idea of the library being driven from an ethic of care for our community, care for the health of the people we serve. And that should be all people. And I think it really comes to, I think I feel for sympathetic librarians who want to make change, but have sort of a board or a director that just doesn't see it. And I think maybe leading from the heart is one of the number one places to go, and talking through how these decisions affect people's lives, and how we don't want the library to be a space that damages people's lives. We want to build them up. And then you have to get into how policing can damage people's lives, or how throwing people out can damage their lives. So I would say, you know what, and I think this is true for all libraries, we need to be building, I don't know, an intranet destination, if you've got an intranet in your organization, or just a binder full of organizations you've built relationships with that you can turn to for different situations. So even in a rural community, there's certain to be AA sponsors, maybe or Al-Anon, which is like siblings and allies of people with addiction. Reach out to them for support. Maybe there's local hospital, mental health places, and then asking people in crisis or people who are having trouble, who can I call to help you out? What can we do? And this speaks to what Emily mentioned about what is being communicated when you call the police versus what is communicated when you sit and talk with someone to work out a problem. I personally believe information is communicated in so many different ways, through our own actions, through what we put on the shelves and the walls. And I would say that patrons watching us sitting with, for example, the boy wailing on the vending machine, see that, oh, the staff here cares about this boy and is going to sit with him and talk with him and really try to peacefully work this out, instead of, I like to say that the police are sort of like a hammer, when what we need, and like, imagine a quilt that's shredded. What you need is a needle and thread. You don't need a hammer, but calling the police is like calling for a hammer when you have this tear in the fabric. So I hope that answers that, but it's an ongoing question I know everybody struggles with.
So I think this really relates to a lot of the research that I do about freedom of expression and free speech. So what I remind people is that often we are talking, when we discuss things that are controversial, we're discussing things with people who often agree with us. So I am, of course, in communities where Black Lives Matter is not in any way controversial, but that is not true in many communities. Black Lives Matter is seen as a hate group. And this is why I really emphasize to my students that the terms hate speech, hate groups, those are not agreed upon terms. They are always contested and political and embedded. They have to do with who you are speaking to at that time. And this is why I always get very nervous when people talk about banning certain things. That's why I study intellectual freedom and censorship, because I always think, who is making those decisions? If we took something to the Supreme Court right now that talked about hate speech or hate groups, I do not know how that would come out with the people who are currently there. And so when I hear about rural places that don't support Black Lives Matter, to me, it's not so much about the term Black Lives Matter. It's about, how do you show support for people who are underrepresented and marginalized in your community? That's the actual work that needs to be done. And so the problem with, so I guess what I'm saying is, like, a lot of times we get really thinking about things like symbolic terms, right? But it's actually, this is what I mean, like, it's actually the work of the individual librarians, of the directors, of the board, to look at their actual policies and then to put those policies into practice in ways that actually support people's lives. I know that some symbols are important. I actually study symbols all day. That's exactly what book banning is. I have a whole book about people being into symbolic banning. But that's not the actual work. And often these are things that there are underlying issues that are not addressed. And to me, the more important thing is to address those underlying issues. So I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about what the police are. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. So I've been thinking about this a lot. What do we mean by police? And one thing that really strikes me in the United States is that our police are always armed. So no matter where you go, what you do, when you call the police, you are calling someone with a gun. So I have had situations where someone was on my front step, couldn't open the door, I didn't know what to do because it didn't make sense to me that I call someone with a gun for this person, right? I also think about this in my own life. So in Illinois, they've extended the time when you can keep your driver's license. I got my driver's license renewed because if something goes wrong, I will be talking to someone with a gun, right? If I get pulled over, I don't want to give anybody any excuse for any reason for me to be involved with the police, because it's always someone who is armed. Our police is a paramilitary force. I think that's incredibly important. I also think a lot about the fact that, and I'm sure some people won't like this, but often the police are late, right? Something has already happened, and then someone with a gun shows up, right? So the incident, someone has been robbed, whatever has happened, and then someone shows up with a gun, which is in many ways symbolically an escalation in and of itself. I have these pictures here because I think they show a bit how there is a disconnect with having someone who is armed in this public space that is the library, and also to show that the police is a militarized institution. So I guess what I'm saying is, what do we need? One thing I find that's, people argued once again about the symbolic idea of defunding the police, but this is a symbol. What we're actually saying is, who else can I call, right? For this homeless person, for these kids in the library. How can I make sure that someone who is not armed shows up if I need backup? So I'm going to send it over to Jarrett.
Yeah, and just that's a perfect lead in to this concept that Emily and I want to impart, which is the most important, which is the number one thing we want to impart, is if you are working in a library, keeping this question in mind. I have a situation right now. Do I need armed backup? And that's viewing the police in a way as an extension of the library staff. Do I need armed backup for this situation? That question itself hopefully can lead people to realize I've got to figure out a different solution, because lives are at stake if I call for armed backup. The police can do a couple things. They can use their gun, they can use their handcuffs, they can remove a person, and they can arrest a person. There's not a lot more that they're trained to do, although I'm sure that there are many, many police that do lots of different things. Ultimately, that's what you're calling for. Someone who's armed, someone who can remove, and someone who can arrest. We wrote in our article about, some questions to ask yourself. Is this situation dangerous? Do I need police? Do I need armed backup? We didn't have enough space to talk about, we didn't have space to talk about this with more nuance. And that's what I want to get to really quickly here is, I wrote an article with a colleague of mine, Angela Jones, for Library Journal called The Fog of Implicit Bias. And that really came from Angela challenging me, and based on the American Libraries column that Emily and I wrote, to dive deeper into the concept of implicit bias and how it continues to threaten lives, even if you ask questions like, do I need armed backup? And that's because how are young Black patrons especially young Black boys, teen boys, how are they treated in various community spaces? Think about that, and then think about the fact that the library is still considered an open community space. And so do we want them treated the way they would be treated walking down the street by police who pass them by or think they're doing something wrong in the park when they're roughhousing or just playing? Do we want to also repeat that sort of interaction between the police and them? I want to cut down on it. So the problem of implicit bias. So when it comes to police, as we all know, they work from this point of view of reasonable articulable suspicion, which means they can say, I believed that something was going on. And when you think about teen boys, patrons calling the police on teens, when they show up, they can interpret disrespect in simple responses from teens like, what did I do wrong? Or age typical rudeness, or especially flight, which I think is age appropriate and understandable for boys or anybody interacting with the police, especially if they're a person of color, just given how the police operate in America. Flight is a disaster when it comes to how the police interpret that. Do we want to be the source of setting up a situation like that in our library because they were roughhousing or because they were arguing? And how this ties back to implicit bias is a white librarian especially might see a bunch of teen boys roughhousing and actually think danger. So anyone on this call might think, oh, well, of course, they're just playing, they're being kids. But so many different people interpret that behavior instinctively in a different way because of implicit bias. So they might say, do I need armed backup for this? And a lot of people might go, yes, I do, because that's scary, even though the boys are just playing. So it's an ongoing question that I continue to try and tackle, is like, how do we uproot that implicit bias on the part of library staff so they don't call police, that they instead step back and say, can I just talk to them? Or if it is a true problem, how can I get someone else to help instead of the person with the gun? So I don't know how we ultimately uproot that implicit bias so that they see age appropriate behavior for what it is. It's an ongoing question, and I welcome comments and emails and suggestions, because I do believe lives are on the line. It's not a belief. Sorry.
So I just wanted to add to that. So one thing about being a Black person in the United States is that you actually aren't encouraged to play in the same way that others do. I recently went to a workshop for young Black boys, and the person who was in the workshop encouraged them to come up with stories. And he said, you know, how often are you asked in school to come up with your own story, and to write it out and to play? And I think this has to go with the fact that we have Black kindergartners who are suspended, right? It's the way in which Black people are constructed in this society, not as people who are full and autonomous beings and have as basically human beings. Like, that's not really how we are constructed, starting from a very young age. And so this goes into this idea of implicit bias. It's that it's simply not seen as play. When we see Black teenagers, and I'm part of this society as well, I mean, we are all part of this, right? That's the other thing about structural racism, is that it harms us all, and we all have these implicit biases. Do we see, even I as a Black woman, Black teenagers playing as play, roughhousing as play? How do I make sure that I am not being infected by the white supremacy of this world to see that? It's very difficult. I guess one thing I want to get across is that when we say, do you need armed backup? What is the actual response? These are not easy things to do. They really mean that you have to step back and say, what do I see? What am I doing myself? Am I actually reacting to the situation in the right way? So I think we should go to the next one.
Yeah, no, Emily, you have opened up so many thoughts, and that will be a whole nother discussion about just Black children, because you're absolutely right. We're not encouraged to play. A lot of times the little girls will look sexually, and boys will look as a threat. So that is a definitely different topic. And I do want to be mindful of the time. So please make sure we cover everything that you have.
I just want to mention really quickly the visual information of having police in the libraries. What does it convey to Black youth? Does the police presence in the library undermine the library's efforts to communicate to them that we value them? And then also I think of this I heard Jason Reynolds speak once where he just said, this was like last May, speaking as a Black man, he said, we just want people to mind their own business so we can mind our own business. And libraries are places where everyone should feel like they can be alone if they want to, that they can mind their own business and people will leave them alone too. I think police presence ruins that sense of safety and of not being surveilled. And that's toxic. But yeah, moving on, I think, so at the Skokie Library where I am, we've had a couple trainings for de-escalation, how to have those conversations to de-escalate a tense situation. And I really think those are very, very important. And I think it needs to be an ongoing training. And that's rough because underfunded libraries, rural libraries, libraries that just don't have an understanding like administratively about this might not commit at all to this, but it's so crucial because you analyze things like body language and talking and, you know, how to have a conversation that will lower the temperature of things. And that work is hard. It's very hard. When we did the role playing, I felt like I did terribly. And it's hard work that takes practice. So it takes a lot of practice, but I think it's crucial because it can absolutely cut off any, oh my God, things are getting heated, call the police sort of situation. And then ask if you're an administrator, how do our staff feel supported? Do they feel at the library where I am, if something's going on with teens, you know, they're wrestling in our teen space or throwing things, we can call other young adult librarians because we're all on staff together. We can call safety staff who we know won't come in roughly and will, you know, probably know the kids from relationship building. We can call librarian in charge, who's the person also usually trained in de-escalation. And then that's a lot of support. And so, you know, if your staff feel like they need to handle a ton of people at the reference desk and then a ton of people just, you know, over here, and it's just one of them, that it's understandable completely that they feel overwhelmed. So a lot of calls I feel like are out of desperation because they don't feel supported. And I'm really sympathetic to that. Any further thoughts about that, Emily, before we talk about patrons?
No.
This is an issue which is very hard, I think, for us to control. And I've seen it at multiple libraries that I've worked at. What do you do about patrons who call the police? It's usually teenagers that I've seen. So they don't come to staff, they just call the police right away. Or they call the police because they saw something right outside the library, and then they just walk on into the library. What do you do about that? I'm in like very early stages of trying to figure this out with my colleagues. And you know, the number one thing we could come up with is like signage and ways to communicate to patrons as often as possible. If you see something that you're concerned about, or if you have a problem, please come to talk to staff about it. Don't take it into your own hands, because there are people all around. And some people don't realize it, that like we're all around and we want to help. It's an ongoing problem because a lot of times police will be called because a patron called and nobody on staff did, and we didn't even know the police arrived. I think that's a big problem. But yeah, if anyone has ideas about that, I'd love to hear it.
I do want to go to the questions. You guys have a lot of questions, and
Okay.
one is the first one I want to start is probably going to go right to you, Emily. So do you have recommendations for staff at an academic library in an urban setting open to the public where there is no additional funding for extra staff with special training or library-specific security staff? Sometimes staff safety is an issue too.
I think it's a hard question because it's difficult, because you have to really think about the individual incidents that are happening, right? And I think this goes to what we were just saying about the patrons calling the police. I think that should not be your first go to. You know, once again, Jared doesn't even have to tell me those are probably white patrons calling the police, not black patrons calling the police. I rarely call the police about anything, right? That's just not something I do. I'm not interested in talking to the police. So, you know, it's really thinking for your talking to, I understand there's not additional support, but thinking through what other options do we have besides calling for armed backup? Is there something else we can do? And I understand that there's staff safety issues. I really do. It's just, is that the best first choice? Maybe that should be the third choice. What other, I think this really is something that all the staff have to talk about together. What other choices could we make? Because that's really what this is about, is making other choices. Not the choice that seems the easiest, or like kind of taking it off of your hands, right? Because you're kind of shuffling it off to another department, to some other people. But is that the best first choice to call the police? I think it rarely is, honestly. You know, so we didn't get to our last slide, but I'll show it now as to why this is so important. This is stolen, and it's Adrian Brannon. These are all people who have been killed by police. He takes each year of their lives, and he colors their faces, he draws their faces, and then he takes each year and sees how long he has to be able to do the final coloring for them. So for each person, you can see that he can never complete the work, right? Their lives have been stolen. So when you call the police, you're actually putting people's lives in danger. I think that's where we are not always making that connection. And it took me a while to realize that myself, right? Like, it's not something I just knew right away. I knew I didn't call the police very often, but now if I'm in a situation, like when that guy was at my door, I stepped back and I said, what is the right thing to do here? What makes most sense? Do I want to bring someone who is armed into this situation? I've also seen people in the street and been like, do I want to bring someone armed into this situation? Right? Someone is ranting, whatever might be happening. I'm worried about that person. But honestly, I'd be more worried if the police were there than if they are just ranting. A lot of times police are just going to escalate the situation, and people's lives are lost when this happens.
And it becomes even more complicated in a library setting when police might be called because somebody is, say, intoxicated, and you know, that was the choice that was made. That situation might be solved peacefully with the policeman or, you know, whoever, and they're leaving the library, and then they insert themselves in some kind of situation that had nothing to do with themselves and that they were not called in to even deal with, but they often will insert themselves. So say a teenager is talking with safety staff and arguing, cop is on his way out the door and then says, what's going on here? And suddenly we're at an entirely different level. So not only calling on a certain person puts lives at risk, but it puts the lives of just people in the space at risk because of how police approach situations. I know there's probably way more questions.
Yeah.
Please, there's a lot. So can you both weigh in on the Coffee with the Cop program that folks are having in their libraries? Is it good or bad? Wendy has said she's had them in the past, and she was hoping that it would foster a positive interaction between community and cops. And she says with this past year, she's rethinking that.
So I would say that this really goes to structural issues. Individual police officers are fine, but I think it's always important to remember that our police is a paramilitary organization. You cannot be a police officer in this country unless you are willing to walk around with a gun. It's not even possible to join the profession without wanting to carry a gun. That is not true in all countries. It's the way that we have structured our police to be essentially an armed militia. That's really how we have our police structured. It's not the way it has to be, but it's how it is. So I think it's important to think about that. I wouldn't say if it's good or bad to have coffee with a cop. I would just say, I hope that the police in that situation are also willing to make changes, perhaps to put more social workers on their own force, to think about what other services they might offer, to see who could be called. You know, when you call 911, you get fire department, ambulance, or police. It'd be nice if we could also get social workers and they were paid more also. You know, I mean, there are lots of other, it'd be nice to have more options, I guess, is what I'm saying. But to me, this is an overall structural problem with policing in the United States, that it must be an armed military, paramilitary force.
Okay, oh, so many good questions. I can't even go through them all. But someone wanted to highlight and wanted to also make sure that this would be right, about incorporating training into staff and departmental meetings, and to make staff more aware of the resources available in addition to just calling the police. So they were referring back to what Jared mentioned about the notebook of resources. And if you guys probably have general resources that can help them start their notebook.
So that takes a deep dive, I think, into local, who you've got locally, and reaching out to those organizations. When I was at I used to work at ACLU of Illinois, and I functioned as a reference librarian, even though I was actually the person answering the call, the phone at the front. And I didn't realize till later, so many of my calls were people looking for help. And it was help that we couldn't provide, but it was my job to connect them with who could. And we would get calls from Southern Illinois calling Chicago, asking who can help me down here. And it was my job to help them investigate that. And I mentioned that just because I was shocked at how many different options there are. There are people, and I only hit on the AA idea today, even though I know there's privacy issues with AA. There's always sponsors who are more public. It's really looking into your own community, I believe, and seeing who's right there that you might be able to call to say, I've got this issue, I've got somebody who needs help. And I think that's where the binder needs to begin. We've been doing that in young adult services with the health department in Skokie, and some social workers who work with youth. You know, we can't trade personal information, and they can't either, but it's been good to know we can even reach out to different people to help us out when we see a repeat issue. But yeah, I would say start locally and really deep dive to see who you can talk to.
Yeah, I also want to say the thing about the dollar with the vending machine. You know, that's the sort of choice that is even easier to make, right? Just give the person their money back. I know a lot of libraries use petty cash and they use it as a budget line. I actually think this is a bad idea for libraries. I think that you should just have some petty cash around for things like this. It seems like it's not related, right? It seems like it's not. But in many ways, just being able to help somebody out with something simple, and it's not based on one person having $1 or $5. I have no cash on me ever. So, you know, I mean, that sort of thing can actually make a difference. So you might think about something like that. There's a lot of questions about what can we do, but I'm a big believer in asking people in your community, asking your staff. You'd actually be surprised at how many tentacles people have in various places within your staff, within your community. You can actually ask your patrons, right? Your patrons might actually know some people who would be good to talk to, who would be good first people. There are, I know most of you know about gatekeeping theory. There are gatekeepers in your own communities who might be the best person to call, and they might just be someone's grandma who could come and talk to somebody. It doesn't necessarily have to be formal. It could be something informal.
That reminds me, Emily, when I was at Evanston Library, a teenage girl had been working for 2 hours on typing a paper that she had handwritten. And at the end of the 2 hours, she lost the entire document. And she was so angry, and she was really, really losing control of her emotions. And I am a really fast typer. I just typed it for her. I was done in 4 minutes, and it just ended the situation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think this actually goes to something that we didn't talk about sometimes when you call in the police, which is the issue of embarrassment. So that didn't come up, and frustration. Sometimes your job as a librarian is to relieve people's frustration. I remember teaching people how to mouse, how to use a mouse, how to do these little things just to relieve frustration, which can escalate very quickly. This is just part of the job. We didn't talk about this one, which was, thinking about work. What is library work? How unpredictable it is, how different it could be from day to day. That's one of the most important and one of the best things about being a librarian. One of the things I miss the most, which is that you never know what your day is going to be like when you arrive. It could be nothing much, and it could be just all sorts of things happening. You have no idea from day to day what's going to happen. And that's really one of the exciting things about library work.
We're totally over time. So this will be the last question. I could listen to you, Emily and Jared, all day. I really just appreciate you covering this topic, because it's not an easy topic. And I'm just glad that we are having this discussion, and for folks to really think about what they should do in the next situation. And the default should not be to call the cops. So this is the last question. What are some strategies for addressing policing and surveillance policies that are steeped in whiteness and property ownership as a framework and not care for people? How can library policies support a transformative justice framework?
Get rid of library fines. That's one of the easiest. I know I've argued with directors about this one. But that's one of the easier ones to do. Look at your behavior policies. Who is most affected by your behavior policies? What sort of norms do they reflect? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change them, but review them, think about it. Think about who is most impacted by those, especially the behavior policies that you have. There are a lot of arguments about respectability politics, whiteness, norms, all those sorts of things. There are certain behaviors that you expect in a library, but thinking through, well, who is just really impacted because we have these policies? Do they actually make sense for everybody in the library? Do they not actually make sense for the people who are 7 years old, right? Or who are 15? Do they need different policies? I don't know if that makes sense. I guess I'm just saying to review what you actually have, with an eye for who is impacted by it.
And also advocate for more empathic policies, especially if you have the director or administrator's ear. I want to call out my boss, Laurel Johnson, has done great work in Skokie Public Library, especially in young adult services, because of how tight young adult staff and safety staff are and how many conversations we have about different patrons' needs. And she has also advocated to administration over and over and over about the effects of police presence in the library, especially on teenagers. And she's spoken from experience, but she's also spoken from just her knowledge to illuminate, sort of enlighten them, educate them about this where they had not thought about it before. And I think that does touch on the whiteness and sort of the not sort of, but how white folks basically take for granted that the cops are good. And of course we should call them. That kind of challenging that narrative and that attitude is really important. And in terms of Skokie Library, like, the police are hardly ever called for young adult issues by staff. And I really think that's because of how much work Laurel and the rest of us in young adult have done. And when, like I said before, when they are there, often it's because a patron is called. That's not always the case though, but yeah.
So I would like to remind everyone that Emily and Jared's powerful plea to protect Black patrons was shared in American Libraries magazine. In it, they argued that libraries should resist calling the police and seek peaceful methods of helping distressed patrons. Again, I thank you, Emily and Jared, for having this discussion with us today.
Thank you for having us.